Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. I will shortly introduce just our guest tonight, DeRoo. Rebecca is Associate Professor in the Department of School of Communications and the Museum Studies program at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Her research and teaching focus on exhibition studies, contemporary art, photography, and cinema. And her most recent book examines the work of Agnes Varda. Agnes Varda between film, photography, and art. Rebecca, thanks for joining us tonight.
Oh, it's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for this invitation and this opportunity to speak about my favorite Varda film.
That's great. We love it as well. We're all big Agnes Varda fans, so we're really happy for you to be here and to talk about this with us. I would like to start this discussion by exploring the political dimension of the film. So I read an interview that Varda made in 1975, and I'll just read a short extract from it, which made me curious about what your thoughts on it are. She said, "I didn't want to make a political film. I didn't ask them, what about the revenue office? What about the taxes? What about the future? Don't you want anything to change? Who do you vote for?" Instead, I tried to have a rather quotidian approach, trying to capture the way that these people live and their gestures. So this is her statement about the film. She didn't want to make a political film. Nevertheless, we do think that Agnes Varda is quite a political filmmaker, and maybe even if this film is not openly a political film, it might implicitly say quite a lot of things about politics and also about Varda's position in this sense. I'm also thinking in terms of her filmography, before and afterwards, there's quite a lot of her work that is explicitly political and that makes quite strong statements. Obviously, thinking of 1968, she was in America, she met the Black Panthers, and afterwards her Cuban experience as well. And shortly after Daguerreotypes, actually her next film I'm thinking is One Sings and the Other Doesn't. So that's another really strong political statement in the form of a musical, but a pro-abortion musical. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on this statement that she makes and about the film in general, like the political dimension of this film implicitly?
Well, I think Varda was sometimes quiet about the politics of her films, and I think part of that was the kind of work she had to do to collaborate funding through, co-productions and different, sources. So I think she was often quiet about the politics for that reason, but I also think she didn't want to be didactic either. And I agree with you that for many years, this has been seen as an apolitical film. It's been seen because of the title Daguerreotypes, which references a 19th century practice of portrait photography. People have seen the film as this kind of sentimental portrait album of her neighbors, or this kind of quaint look at her street, the Rue Daguerre, which is named for the French inventor of photography, Louis Daguerre. This kind of quaint, sentimental, nostalgic look at her immediate neighbors on the Rue Daguerre in the 14th arrondissement of Paris, where she lives and works. But I think it's important to consider the political context of the film. And I see the film as very much speaking back to this context, even though it's not explicitly said as such within the film. In France, after the Second World War, there is a period called the Trente Glorieuses, or the 30th glory years of economic expansion following World War II. And this was marked by people flocking to cities, an increase in urbanization, growth of multinationals and chain stores. And at the time Varda was making this film, the Montparnasse Tower in her neighborhood of Paris was under construction. And it was a 59-story monolith that was supported by American multinational, was part of larger urban renovations being promoted by the Prime Minister and then President Georges Pompidou. So that this tower combined rail lines, shopping malls, office buildings. It was radically changing the fabric of the city and the nature of work and of daily life. So in choosing to focus her camera on the lives and labors of these small cell phone shops and the shopkeepers and the laborers who work there, who would become, gradually become extinct because of these kind of mega complexes and transportations and shopping centers and chain stores. It's very much, I think, an effort to capture lives and labors that were disappearing, and also to make us aware of that fact as viewers.
Sure. I'm also thinking, well, yes, that was the period of the economic boom just after the Second World War. Well, it was already the 70s, but it kind of comes after that period. And yes, as you said, I think there's also a pretty visible urban transformation, and you can kind of sense the consequences of this gentrification that's kind of coming to get that area of Paris almost.
Absolutely. So during this period in the 60s and the 70s, Pompidou undertook a radical renovation of Paris. So this often meant targeting worker, poor, immigrant neighborhoods that were deemed ripe for renewal, in quotation marks, and gentrifying them. And with the inhabitants being displaced to the suburbs that were also being developed by Pompidou. There were middle-class suburbs, working-class suburbs, and also suburbs for kind of low-income state-subsidized housing. And at the same time, he was building rail lines to get in and out of Paris. So this is a period of time where the fabric of Paris was changing radically. Kristen Ross has written about how from the 50s to the 70s, the proportion of workers living in Paris declined by more than 40%, and the affluent residents of Paris increased by over 50%. So there's this kind of social segregation that was taking place, that was being critiqued by artists and intellectuals like Varda, and who are other groups such as the Situationists International that saw this as an increased form of state control, of spatial and economic segregation. And we can see it in little bits and details in the film. There, the scenes of the interview with the butcher's wife in her home, and you can see the packages of commodities that have been bought from some kind of chain store in the background. So there's a sense that even in these kind of details of daily life, the shopkeepers were kind of unwittingly participating in this new economy of chain stores and malls that would ultimately bring about the demise of their own way of life and the kind of these small self-run shops on their street.
Yeah. I was also thinking it's quite interesting, this idea or this perception that we have about the film as being picturesque, because I do think it is true, like watching this film now, there's some images that are extremely somewhat stereotypical of what we would think of France in those years, the baguettes and this constant sound of the accordion. But it's interesting, I noticed that at the beginning of the film, what she says, in fact, is, I'm not trying to give a picturesque image of this neighborhood. I'm literally just like going to the closest shop. I'm not picking the picturesque shops on Rue Daguerre. I'm just picking the ones that are really my neighbors, the ones that I see every day. But I think it's just interesting to reflect on how years later, it just comes across as a really picturesque depiction of Paris, somehow involuntarily, I guess, because that was not her intention.
But it's a really great point. And yeah, she has spoken about how, she captured her neighbors and as far as the electrical cords would reach. So really the shops in close proximity to her own home and studio. But I do think she is playing on these tropes of old France. And at this time that Paris was massively being renovated and under construction and being, quote, modernized, in the words of the president, there were there were voices, like I'm thinking of Louis Chevalier, who was a preservationist and wrote for the newspapers and also published a text called The Assassination of Paris, where they were arguing they were trying to hold on to these kind of traditional forms of French culture, like the baguette baker, or the accordion music, right? So there's this, there are these tropes of old France, but then we see modern types of labor. We see the auto instructor. Pompidou was famous for adapting Paris to the automobile. So, we see these new forms of labor. And then throughout, Varda's showing these kind of social stratifications and these different conditions of labor as well. So in these self-run stores where there's supposedly the butcher and the baker, it's clear that the man had trained for his trade, where the woman, trade had been chosen by marriage, and she's tending to the cash register and doing these kind of service jobs, as opposed to the more specialized training that the male shopkeepers had had. Or we see the gentlemen who have immigrated from North Africa, who are working the late shift at the convenience store, or the local grocer. So at the same time as she's giving us these very kind of close looks at her neighbors, we're seeing these, economic disparities and these differences in labor that have to do with national origin or immigration status or gender, for example.
Yeah, that's very true. And in terms, you mentioned the word immigration, and I think that's another very big topic when talking about this film. Around half an hour in, she kind of introduces all of our characters. So we have these single shots of each of them introducing themselves and stating very, very proudly, I would say, where they are from. And we do realize that none of them are from Paris, absolutely none of them. Most of them are from France. And then, as you said, there's someone from Northern Africa as well. So I think that gives us an idea of how immigration was already such a huge part of Paris in those years. And yeah, I think that's another really interesting thing. And she says this very poetic thing about the fact that you can feel their emotion when they talk about their birthplace. And what she says is, the truth about the 14th arrondissement in Paris is that its pavement smells like soil, meaning none of them are from Paris, none of them are from the city, they're all from the countryside. So this is very interesting as well.
Yeah, it's just, she's absolutely capturing these different waves of immigration. And one of the things Agnes recounted to me once is that a number of the people in the film are from the kind of west of France, because the local train station, the Montparnasse train station, serviced the west of France. So many people from the west settled. The gentleman from Tunisia who's interviewed, who talks about dreaming of, or thinking of his family who are, were not able to join him. Also, alludes to the fact that after North African independence from France, there are still these kind of waves of immigration, but with limited kind of work visas. Varda doesn't explain what the circumstances are there, but we're led to think about, why his family is not able to join him as, as the other kind of mom and pop stores have.
Yeah. You were mentioning that you have met Varda and were able to speak to her, which is absolutely great. And I was wondering if you have any memories of her telling you about this film, or anything that she might have said about this film in particular. Any memories?
Well, she did bring out the part of about the people being from the west of France and wanting to capture, this kind of history of migration to Paris. I would say one of the other things that really marked my thinking about the film was in Varda's archives, because I spent a number of years working in Varda's archives, reading her personal papers. And in it, it's interesting because at moments, I think in her notes, there's a bit of a frustration with some of the shopkeepers for not being more politically organized at this time, that their life and labors are being, ways of life and things are being threatened. But then, and in the film she says, well, at the other end of the street, they sell political newspapers and discuss politics, but not at our end. They say it's bad for business, right? And but I think she, in the notes talks about the kind of the need to serve the client and this kind of this very challenging situation that the shopkeepers are in. So I think there's at the end, she ends the film asking, is it a reproach? Is it an approach? Is it a homage, right? And so I think, she has mixed feelings, right? I think there is, as someone who's been involved with political internet global activist movements herself, I think there is a wish that some of the workers were more politically engaged, but I think also a recognition of the privilege of that position of being able to protest that, that she has in her work that may not be possible for these workers whose livelihood depend upon, maintaining the clientele.
Yes, absolutely.
Can I add something on the topic of immigration? Just because you write about this specific man from Tunisia, and you write it in your book, and it's very interesting the point you make about how she's depicting him. He, instead of being at the shop like the other people in the film, he's shown in his home and in a posture that reminds of this sort of exotic paintings and, well, the posture of the Ovalet. So I was wondering if you could comment a bit more on that, because I think it's very interesting and maybe it's something that people don't notice that much because it's quite quick, but it's very interesting. And I think it's also a bit related to what we've been discussing about. She's not overly political, but I think she's really making a point there about how marginalized this person is within this community. We don't really know what these people think about this immigrant, if he's there to steal their jobs, which is something we hear in the media constantly about today's immigration. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could explain a bit more about that.
Absolutely. And it's an excellent point you're making, that whereas the other shopkeepers are presented in their stores because they're the owners, presenting him at home is a signal that he does not own the store in which he works. And he lives in what would be called in colloquial French, the maid's quarters, right? So it's a very modest apartment. It's a pejorative term, but used colloquially, right? And I think she's, depicting him in his modest apartment very deliberately. And Varda herself, came out of a background in photography. And so, I think she's also very highly aware of the legacy of a kind of visual culture of exoticism and cliche that is part of a colonial legacy regarding, French depictions of North Africa. For example, the title daguerreotypes can be understood in various ways, right? And, one of the things is I see her referencing this idea of photographic types that were typologies. And so typologies could be pictures of different types of work, but in the colonial era in the 19th and early 20th century, there were also so-called ethnic types created by photographers in French North Africa. And these were, constructions, with makeshift backdrops, but they often showed reclining nude women or semi-nude women as a kind of odalisque figure that was filled with, kind of exoticism and sensuality. And, it was this kind of mythology of harem women, and other kind of, colonial era stereotypes, that were circulated highly in France. So instead of the woman reclining as the odalisque, she's showing this gentleman from Tunisia that had been a French protectorate, reclining in his bed but wearing red pajamas, right? And so, there's a kind of nod to this colonial era stereotype. At the same time, she's kind of humorously, challenging it. But I also think she wants to make us uncomfortable with watching those scenes too, as we're watching these kind of still pictures of the workers. They're kind of portraits, but we see their nervousness and their fidgeting and their breath. And so I think she also wants us to be uncomfortable with our voyeurism. She's inviting us to kind of come to know them a bit better, but also making us uncomfortable with this, with our kind of spectatorship. You know, we see them fidgeting and nervously in front of the camera.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, because Isabel from the audience was asking about the photographic connection, and apart from just the title, and I think you've introed that quite well, and just wanted to know if you wanted to add any more to that in terms of why daguerreotypes work so well as a title, but also what it means to Agnes as a photographer herself.
That's a great question. So part of the reason for the title is because she lives on the Rue Daguerre in Paris, which is named for Louis Daguerre, the 19th century, one of the inventors of photography in France. So it's Daguerre Street. But the daguerreotype as a photograph is different from many 19th century photographic processes. Daguerreotypes were not printed on paper, but instead they're single positive images that were made within a camera on a polished silver surface, which is almost like a mirror. And then the images were fixed and placed in protective casing. And so the daguerreotypes as photographs are very interesting because they have a reflective surface where you see your own reflection in them. They have this mirror-like surface, and depending on the angle that they're held and the light reflected in them, they can seem to shift from positive to negative, like a positive to a negative image. So I think Varda plays on the notion of the daguerreotype in different ways in the film. I mean, there are reflections. You see all these window reflections, or when she shows her own shop window, you see her reflected and her daughter Rosalie and her head camerawoman Nurith Aviv reflected in the surface. And so I think she's constantly reminding us that, like the surface of a daguerreotype, this is an image. It's not a kind of portrait, or a portrait of other people, but it's this intermixing of self with subject. And so we hear her voiceover, we see her mirrored reflections, and it's this kind of constant reminder of how both the filmmaker and the subjects are kind of constructed in dialogue with one another. And I think, she's also reminding ourselves that we're also, whether we see it as a positive or a negative image, and she's using it as the daguerreotype as a kind of metaphor, right? That, it depends on our perspective viewing the film, how we choose to view its subjects.
I think in terms of Varda being so present in the film, is quite interesting. She has many different ways of doing that throughout the film. And what I was thinking is, in particular to me, the whole sequence with the magic show, with the magician, there's a really heavy work of editing there, which is very playful and very, very much very Varda-esque. It's a very Varda fashion, I think, to use that kind of very playful editing. But it's also very interesting. So what we see is the show, so the magician doing a show, and juxtaposed we have images of the workers doing their own work. And I think it's so interesting for so many reasons, but one of the things that made me think is for sure the fact, well, first of all, to me, there was really something about the magic of cinema and of editing. So what I thought first of all was Orson Welles and the way that he also is very playful with editing. And for example, F for Fake, where in a moment you think you know everything, and then the moment afterwards you're left a bit clueless about what's really happening, and you don't trust the director anymore, almost, because of all this game that's been played with editing, which is almost like a magic trick. So there's really something about this magical power of editing throughout the film, which I think makes us very conscious of the fact that, yes, this is a documentary, we're talking about real life, we're filming real people, but there's always this dimension of staging things also in a documentary, and there's always this kind of subjectivity of the filmmaker as well. So I think it's a really interesting scene, the way that she handles it.
Yeah, I think it's a great, I love the scenes with the magician because they're kind of underscoring her role, as you're saying, as filmmaker, and the process of editing, and, you know, reminding us as spectators not to be so comfortable in our assumption that what we're seeing is accurate or true, but highly subjective and mediated by the filmmaker. And so, yeah, I you know, from the very beginning where the magician says, ladies and gentlemen, you know, and he's introducing daguerreotypes by Agnes Varda, you know, she's aligning herself with this figure of the magician. I see her as making kind of reference to Georges Méliès, who was an early French film pioneer of the late 19th and early 20th century, who was a magician turned filmmaker and known for appearing as a magician in his film, and who did, you know, magic tricks that were accomplished by editing or sleight of hand and trick of the eye. And so at the same time, I think, as Varda's alluding to these different traditions of documentary photography and film, and this need to capture and, you know, examine, she's also reminding us of the limitations and the fact that the workers that appear in her film also appear on the magic, you know, they're, you know, appear on stage with the magician and part of the act, and then sit down in the audience and he takes the final bow, right? It's a sense of that they're playing a part in the magician's act, but also in Varda's film, and you know, all these the kind of very exaggerated special effects, I think, in those sequences with the amplified sound or the tricks with mirrors and lights, right? That, you know, it's all about this kind of this fabrication through editing. And I think I will circle back briefly to the previous question about photography too, because I think that's also related in referencing 19th century photography. You know, Varda does so you know, partly by having the shopkeeper stand in these frontal poses for multiple seconds in these still shots, much like one would have to hold their pose for a long exposure in the 19th century. She's talked about how she uses uneven fades throughout the film, much like the covering of an old-fashioned camera's lens. And so I think, you know, there's this kind of layering of a kind of reflection of what photography and film can and cannot capture. There's a sense of these still, you know, photographs where the subjects are silenced and immobile, right? So there's an image, but all that we aren't capturing. And even within the film, the magic act underscores the, you know, the sense of, you know, not just seeing this as an informative or educational documentary, but also entertainment, and the kind of the editing and the subjectivity that goes into that. But even the end of the film, where the owners of the Blue Thistle go home and close the door on our, you know, and kind of, you know, their home is closed off from our view. So there's always a sense of the subjects of the film existing beyond the film frame, you know, beyond what a photograph or an individual film can capture. And I love that Varda is always reminding us of those limits of what she can know and what we can know as spectators.
Yeah, I think another interesting point that just came to my mind about the Magic Act again is just the fact that as we see all the neighborhood taking part to the Magic Act, we also encounter again the Northern African gentlemen, and we can see that they're still wearing their work clothes. And this also tells a lot about, as you were saying, the fact, you know, there are different types of migrants and different types of classes in the neighborhood as well.
Absolutely. So, and there are moments where she shows the different shots of the street, and the tailors are working long hours, but the grocers are working the longest hours. So presumably they're dressed for work because the performance takes place in the evening, and these would be their regular work hours after the other shops have closed. And you know, I think too, you know, Varda is very self-conscious about the kind of power dynamics in the documentary, you know, by, you know, talking about the magician comes from the other side of Paris, right? You know, this kind of metaphor for, you know, being kind of an outsider, right, to the community, and just this kind of this show or this act that's interspersed with these people's lives and labor. You know, I think she's really showing this this metaphor for her control as filmmaker, but also this kind of difference in her socioeconomic position and the type of intellectual and creative labor that she does. Oh shoot, there's something I was thinking of with the magic show that it'll come back to me.
I was going to ask just that we, you know, we all love Agnes Varda, and we started, you know, the first Cinetopia doc we ever did was Faces, Places, and it was part of obviously a resurgence in her work later on in her life, and also just kind of brought a lot of interest in her work. And I can see like her personality obviously in every film that she's always made, but I was wondering, because what Federica and Amaya really said is that we thought she's very much a community filmmaker, and like what Federica just mentioned, this quote of the pavement of Rue de Guerre was, you know, like smells of soil. Very much Faces, Places was about going to those origin locations and the terroir and talking about that, which is very, very important in French society. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of Agnes Varda being a community filmmaker, or how she's maybe shown that kind of similar theme across her films over the years.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this film, I mean, you hear her in voiceover and then the reflections, but she's not appearing on camera to the extent that she does in later films like The Gleaners and I from 2000, or Faces, Places from 2017 with that she co-directed with French street artist, mural artist JR, where they travel throughout France and meet these industrial or agricultural workers. And JR often creates these murals of the kind of subjects, kind of magnifying them in the public space, and this kind of visibility. And Varda and JR kind of came together around this idea of like local documentary, right? Kind of going out into these different places and meeting the different people. What I think is interesting in daguerreotypes is she's sticking to her neighborhood, but really showing these kind of global transformations and, you know, in economies and societies in this very tiny, you know, corner of her neighborhood in Paris, whereas these other films are like The Gleaners and I, or Faces, Places, where it's literally filmed as a road trip, where we see Varda going out and meeting people. But I think there's a similar sense, and what struck me in Faces, Places is she goes to coal mining, former coal mining country in the north of France. And there's a woman, Janine, who's the last inhabitant of a row houses that's meant to be demolished. And they you know, call her Janine the Resistant, and put her image on the exterior of her house as a way of signaling her continued presence. And also this history of the past that's very much manifest in that place. So I do see a very similar spirit of you know, this interest in larger changes in, you know, the economy and how that affects individuals on a very personal or you know, kind of this level of daily life, and how it manifests itself in a kind of urban fabric, or, you know, this kind of the physical and social specificity of the place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we had a discussion about this before, but you know, our idea is love your local, and it's this like right now, even in Edinburgh, this conversation about gentrification is happening, and in New York, it's like I lived in New York for such a while. There's subtlety to a conversation about a local street that matters so much, and I think it goes back to that political thing. But I didn't know if you wanted to talk about the modern you know, relevance of this film in terms of that as all, you know.
Absolutely. And I think you know, looking at it in its time, artists and intellectuals associated with the Situationist International, or philosophers like Henri Lefebvre, were talking about these large changes in French society, from like urban, you know, migration to urban centers, or you know, the growth of multinationals and chain stores, or you know, this demise of this kind of, you know, pedestrian traffic in the city that's becoming more socially segregated, and these kind of growth of transportation modes that are dividing people, and these kind of traditional trades are disappearing in the favor of kind of chain stores and such. Um, uh, so the situation is that we're kind of talking in grand theory, and I love that they argued that you could see these larger contradictions lived at the level of everyday life, but often had these kind of overarching theories. And I love that Varda is in the street, in the shop with her neighbors, talking to them and really hearing the richness of what they say, and capturing the richness of their own words. So rather than kind of being didactic and turning to these overarching things, letting the people speak, and having this kind of conversational exchange with them in the stores. That's quite intimate. I find very powerful. In terms of the present moment, yeah, we're in another moment of the local store and economy, right, being threatened by large mega corporations, and especially in this time of social distancing, and right, where further inhibiting that kind of daily interaction. Absolutely. So as it's speaking to the present moment in many ways. And one of the things that I find interesting too is Varda did a short follow-up to this film on one of her DVDs, where she returns to some of the stores in the early 2000s. And she gives us a glimpse of how life has changed even then. And so she goes to the bakery where we had seen in the film the baker making the bread from scratch every day. And now it's part of a chain. And, they say that there's a team of people who bake like ghosts in the night, right? That aren't living on site, that aren't part of the neighborhood. It's, these people elsewhere that are like ghosts in the night. So, it's a kind of prescient view of the kind of the changes that were underway at that time, and only being exacerbated in the current pandemic and economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, sadly, it's been going on for 40 years in Rue de Guerre, but then those places, at least in these environments like New York and Paris, they're like, all those chains are now going away, because of that. I just personally, I've had such a liking to French cinema, but particularly Agnes Varda's cinema. What made you, drawn to her work, and you, like you said, you got to spend some time with her in her archives and stuff. If there any gleaning something from that experience of why she's such an important filmmaker for us to all continue to look back on.
I feel like there's so much to continue to discover in Varda's work. It's just so incredible. I mean, for so many reasons. As a filmmaker who founded her own production company, and worked to finance work often through co-productions and state subsidies, but it exercised incredible creative control in terms of writing, editing, directing, post-production. That's one incredible aspect of her legacy. I also think, as this multimedia artist, as she's often talked about her three lives, as photographer, filmmaker, and multimedia artist. She began in photography before turning to cinema in the 50s, and then in the 21st century began creating multimedia installation work. So as somebody who worked across not only was she incredibly prolific in cinema, but I feel like across our, visual media, she was creating really innovative work. And I guess what drew me to Varda's work is that I found there were often these kind of visual references in her film that are not spoken, but they're these clues to the film's politics. So as someone with training in art history, as I was watching her films, and we were talking about the image of the man as the odalisque, the Tunisian grocer in the film, in this kind of pose of the odalisque. Throughout her work, there were all these kind of reference that are kind of keys to the work's politics, but because they were unspoken and they're never announced and Varda never pointed them out, I think they opened up this new way of viewing some of her work and the really kind of trenchant social and political critiques that she was making, and oftentimes feminist politics. So for me, that was personally what drew me to her work, is this kind of visual variety and richness. But yeah, there's so many things about Varda's career that are so amazing. I feel like there's so much more just to continue to discover.
Can I just say something to add on to that? Just because I was thinking while I was listening to you, how, you know, how Varda is always, you know, when we speak about filmmaker, we're always trying to look for their influences or who's been an influence of that director. And when I was reading your book, I thought very interesting when you mentioned that with her film La Pointe Courte, everyone was talking about this film being part of the neorealist movement. And even though she didn't really watch any of these films, and this kind of, I got reminded of this when you were speaking about, you know, how fascinating her work is, which I think we all agree. But I think it's also because she's a visionary. She's really is. She was speaking about things way before other filmmakers, or maybe we didn't know about that, but she was speaking about gentrification in the 70s, and now there's thousands of documentaries about that. She was speaking about food waste before it became the new trend to, you know, speak about it. And she always does this in such an accessible way, but as you say, with so much intelligence and knowledge, because she has all of this amazing background. And it really annoys me in a way that when I was reading that she would be compared to, you know, another male filmmaker with an authority, with a voice already, with a name in the canon, and she couldn't be spoken as her own.
Yeah.
I want, maybe if you can talk a bit more about that, how in the latest years, since she actually became more popular, she started to be seen as a filmmaker with a, you know, a name, and not being compared to others, not being the woman of La Nouvelle Vague, not being, you know, Agnes Varda. So because I think it's obviously linked to the feminism in her films as well.
Yeah, I do think absolutely, and you know, so not only has she often disavowed her film's politics, or, you know, in early years, but also her own knowledge of you know, filmmaking and of cultural history. So when she was making her first film, La Pointe Courte, as you're mentioning, in 1954, you know, she always said, oh, I'd hardly ever been to the cinema. I knew nothing about, you know, cinema when I started my career. But in dealing with working with Agnes, and also, you know, working in her archives for years, there's just this incredible body of knowledge and research that she did, you know, for all of her films. And so I think there was this kind of, I think that initially she used this disavowal of, because people would often ask, yes, how are your films like Jean-Luc Godard, or how has your husband Jacques Demy influenced your filmmaking? And so there's this kind of, oh, I haven't seen film, I knew nothing, you know, as a way of I think trying to thwart those inappropriate implications that her work was somehow derivative, or you know, following others. So in the Beaches of Agnes, she kind of acknowledges this, where there's this a cartoon cat that looks like, it's Chris Marker interviewing her using this cartoon cat, and he says, you know, asks her about her early career, and she says, oh, I knew nothing, and he kind of rolls his eyes, or she has the cat kind of roll the eyes in the film. So I think later in life she started to you know, acknowledge, you know, the kind of the fictions of some of those earlier stories. And I could see myself as a researcher. So her home and studio And archives are all centered at the same place in Paris, or editing room. It's all part of the same place. So as a researcher, I would go for months at a time, like, weeks at a time, or stay for a month or longer, and be there working every day from 10 till 10 in the morning till 10 at night. And Agnes would often just kind of come in and say, "What are you working on?" And she would just pull a brochure out of a corner, or open up a box and pull something out, because the archives are not cataloged. So as a researcher, I was kind of working my way through. But whenever I told her what I was working on, she'd leave me a kind of footage, like on a DVD the next day. So she herself had this. She would always argue she never read what was written about her, but she had a very encyclopedic knowledge, I think, of her work and its reception. And her archives just reveal the richness of her careful study and preparation for these films as well. And certainly, as you mentioned, her willingness to speak out more about feminist issues later in her career, really important. Not only acknowledging the feminist politics of some of her films, like was earlier mentioned, like One Sings the Other Doesn't, which is about reproductive rights in the 1970s, and featuring that on kind of International Women's Day shortly before she died, but also speaking out at the Cannes Film Festival, and in participating in the 50-50 by 2020 women's protest on the red carpet at the Cannes Film Festival very late in life. So, very willing. I think there's a feminist strand that runs through her work, but I think, there's also a sense of organizing within the film industry late in life that comes through in her activism too.
Good. I think I have one last point that I would like to discuss, always from the film, and it's the ending. There's this moment where she asks everyone about their dreams. What do you dream about? And it's really quite interesting to see the answers from most of them. For most of them, it's a continuation of my day at work. So I dream about my job. I dream about serving customers. Some people say I don't dream at all. It's really quite interesting, to see this contrast, or this kind of dreams and the working class. Can the working class dream? It's quite interesting, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's a really important and incredible point you've made. And if one thinks about previous avant-garde movements in France, like Surrealism or the Situationists International, these realms of dream or desire or creativity that are not constrained by our work and by the state and these other kind of, responsibilities that we have to assume on a regular basis, those are these potential wells of resistance, right? Whether, creative resistance, or that could be potentially channeled into other ways of not simply occupying the role and the function one has to have in the system. And so, I think, when asking about dreams, yes, she is interested. She is showing the extent to which, even these most private and intimate moments of their lives are often taken up by worries about work, about labor. I think she wants us to recognize there is this moment of or there are these aspects of their lives that can't be subsumed. And I think this comes through in the magic show too, sometimes when you see them playing along with the act, but they're supposedly put to sleep and hypnotized, but they can't help but stifle a smile, right? So there is a sense that there's a kind of role they're playing, or there are these realms of their creativity or imagination that the film can't capture. But I do, and at the end, the magician says he's putting us all to sleep, right? Is it the sleep of capitalism? Is this kind of social immobility or political immobility that she's referencing, right? I think that she would wish for more activism, but I think she's also trying to make us aware of the very real constraints and demands on these individuals' lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a beautiful way to culminate in the film and this discussion. And yeah, I wish I could get rid of that dream I have of serving like food, because it's still haunts me to this day. But I really appreciate, Rebecca, and you being part of this conversation with us. This was a dream come true to have you on our final, it's not our final Cinetopia doc, but it's our final Love Your Local part of this series. And it was really so interesting. And as a lover of Varda's stuff, it was such an honor for you to be part of this. And I just have to say, Federica and Amaya, like, thank you so much for being like, bringing us through this filmic like journey that we've had. It's just really been such a beautiful, journey that we've taken, and it really is so lovely that we ended on daguerreotypes, because it really shows how modern that film is and how beautiful it is. And I just want to thank everybody else for being part of this as well, because like many people responded in the comments, and I didn't come back, on how much they loved this film, how much it ended, and how much your conversation, your messages, Rebecca, really like brought everybody together for our final film. So we just really appreciate it. So
it's a pleasure. Thank you for this opportunity.
And thank you, Federica. Thank you, Maya, and thank you, audience. And
thank you, Amanda.
And yeah, stay tuned for our next Cinetopia doc. We'll announce it. We're excited to tell you what it's going to be in a couple weeks, and it'll be in September sometime. All right, thank you.
Thank you.